Hi everyone. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Product-Led Alliance for the invite and the opportunity to share some thoughts on how our real perceptions become and can influence our thoughts and behaviors. Let's start at the beginning to make sure we're all on the same page. What do we mean when we talk about reality and perception? Reality is defined as the state of things as they actually exist, as opposed to an idealistic or notional idea of them. I think that's pretty straightforward, but to be clear, we're saying it is exactly what it is. No room for interpretation or opinion, despite many people wanting to add their own spin to reality. On the other hand, when we look at how perception is defined, we see that it is the way in which something is regarded, understood, or interpreted, which is basically our specific version of events based on various biases of our own that we've added. Contrary to the title of this talk, perception is categorized as not real. Or at least that's how it's viewed by academics. It's viewed as a skewed and biased way of viewing something. On the other hand, for the person experiencing that perception bias, for them, their perception is in fact real. For them it is what is going on, and many of their decisions will be based on exactly that reality. To better illustrate my point, let's look at some simple examples. There is a story found in ancient Indian texts of blind men and the elephant. It is the story of a group of blind men who come across an elephant for the first time, and each describes the elephant by what their hands feel, although each of them touches a different part of the animal. As you can see in the image, their descriptions vary immensely, and each accuses the others of being liars, clearly showing how they are looking at it at all from a very different spectrum of their own interpretation. In some versions, the blind men even resort to actual violence. Moving into modern times, many of you may have seen the following image from Jeff Patton, which shows a classic example. In the beginning, we're all in agreement because, of course, it all makes sense. But then, when we write it down or discuss it in more detail, we realize, hold on, we're all seeing it in different ways or interpreting it a different way. And then we decide, hold on, maybe we should hash it out until we're actually aligned. And now at the end, we're happy because we all agree and we're all connected and we've all aligned on our thoughts and realities. In both examples, we can see how easily someone can assume that everyone is saying or seeing the same thing. However, each person's perception of the situation is different, and thus they interpret the situation differently. What's interesting is how easily things can evolve in different directions for both parties based on those assumptions. In some cases, the divide can grow larger and create extra complications. I'm sure we've seen it all in our organizations. In modern product organizations, we do our best to reduce the assumptions of events. We are strongly influenced by our interpretation of events every single day and in multiple situations. I've sat down with many people who will play back the interpretation of a situation or a communication that was sent out, and their interpretation is sometimes the exact opposite of truly what was intended, right? And this obviously creates a lot of complication. But why does this happen? Even acknowledging that it happens doesn't seem to reduce the probability of it happening again and again. And then how can we reduce the impact or even remove it completely? It's not an easy question to answer, and then in the next parts we're going to explore that in a bit more detail in terms of the causes and also potential ways of combating some of those challenges. Looking at the challenges we face with misaligned perception, let's be clear on a basic principle. The baseline fact is that our brains are hotwired to take the easy route. What do I mean? Let's go into looking at the book written by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, which everybody talks about, he describes two systems to the brain, right? So the first, system one, is lazy. It jumps to conclusions quickly. It accepts what is presented without digging deeper. It takes things at face value, right? And it doesn't want to do much more work than just accept things as they are. However, system two is more analytical, right? And what it does is it kind of monitors system two, and it is great when we have to solve complex problems, complex issues, right? And it's when we have to exert more effort. Basically, our brain is lazy, and given the option, it wants to jump to the easiest solution, even when it could be completely wrong. In today's tech world, that is even more exacerbated because we already have so many directions and cognitive distractions and cognitive overload that our brain wants to jump to those conclusions rather than asking questions or taking time to really understand what is being said. Let's be honest, it's easy, right? We've got Slack pinging us in the background, we've got an email, we've got our phone that rings, we've got everything else going on, and suddenly, somebody says something, we'll take it at face value. What doesn't help is that many resources focus on someone recognizing their own incorrect interpretation, how they can work on, and how they can work to change their perception bias, right? So if I recognize that behavior or that perception bias in myself, there's a lot of help out there to try and make that change, right? But what happens when we see that perception bias in others, especially when the other person doesn't recognize their own bias, right? Just like the GIF is saying here, right? The person doesn't agree with us or doesn't realize that they do have that perception bias. Let's dig into some of the most common mixed perceptions I've seen personally, and how I found to try and mitigate them. But before getting started, let's just going back to point 2. There are just 5 simple rules that we can help to sort of jump over that natural laziness that our brain has, right? And the things are, it's just these simple rules. Number 1, question your initial response to things, right? Don't assume that what you understood something, your initial response to something is what it is. Just question. Slow down when thinking. Don't jump to the quickest answer possible. Learn and experience new things. And this is an important part, right? It's continuous learning. It's continuous developing. It's learning ways and mechanics to do things differently. Enhance your cognitive abilities through practice and repetition. So this is a habit, right? We have to create it. Reading a book like Atomic Habits might be a good example. Be mindful and open-minded, right? And that's the last one, which is you have to have a clear notion of what's going on, and you have to keep an open mind that as you're interpreting it might not be the correct way. Now, let's look at some practical examples of this in action. Now, the first one is in terms of listening to the team. So sometimes we might have this thought, I want to make the team feel as if they have a voice, but don't want to design by committee, or we'll never reach a conclusion. So you try and figure out what is the best way to kind of open up the room for other people, right? We want the team to feel like they have a voice, but also avoid design by committee. We'll never reach a conclusion. We know we're going to have people who will disagree strongly. We can't please everyone. So in terms of the 2 types of interpretation, what we can see is we have a few people who don't agree or don't understand. All I need to do is set up some time to explain to them better and remove their doubts. But the overall plan just doesn't change. However, on the other side, right, on the other side of the table, people might interpret it as, I've understood what you're telling me, but I don't think you understand all the complexities because you're not in the day-to-day. This just seems like a mess, and you're being stubborn and keep pushing despite us clearly identifying big challenges. And this happens, right? I've seen it happening. It is concrete. Now, the balance is paying attention to the general sentiment. If it's 1 or 2 voices, they can be heard calmly without huge disruption, but the influence is residual. The issue is when there are many voices speaking up or disagreeing. No matter how wrong you think those voices might be, they will influence the sentiment of the group. Equally, the group may seem on board at first, but as the months go by and they don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, which we'll get back to later, the sentiment may go into a negative spiral. In both cases, decisions made by leadership and even their qualifications will be questioned. The important thing is to make sure that they don't double down and keep plowing through when the general sentiment is negative. Be sure to set checkpoints through the process, right? If need be, stop the process to adjust. Admit to both yourself and the team when it fails, but also make it clear what was learned and how you now have a new plan to take that into consideration. If, however, you believe strongly in the change and you see what it will do for the team or organization, you'll have to accept the second guessing of your decisions. You'll have to accept a strong rotation of people. Ultimately, the decision is yours, but you can work to mitigate it. In today's product world, many product leaders want to create transparency and open forums for sharing. So in example 2, we talk about the right level of transparency. The challenge arises when something is shared that hasn't been properly hashed out yet, or will be happening months in the future. Stress because they may start assuming the whole change process as a whole and have difficulty understanding that certain phases will only impact them in months or years. Insecurity, because as much as people say they want transparency and to be involved throughout the process, for them, they expect a big change. They will already be properly defined and set out. Lack of definition on something makes them doubt that all aspects have been properly thought out before making a decision. We all want iterations when building products, but fear when going through an organizational change. On the one side, the interpretation, our leadership style is super transparent and people have an open window to the whole change process we're going to implement. That provides them with confidence and security. They now know when things are going to happen and when it will affect them. On the other hand, the other side might interpret it as, okay, I've now seen a 6-month plan with so much to do. I'm going to get a jump on some of the things right away. But it seems all the resources aren't ready yet. I also didn't understand how this part is going to work. If I want to start that a month early, how do I do it? So as you can see, there's a lot of confusion that can happen, and sometimes it's just one person might be seeing the negative end of the spectrum while the other person is seeing a positive. But the truth of the matter is, each one of them will then have their actions from that moment onwards will be completely different. Now, I found that what works best is to break the process down into small workable parts. And we spoke about that earlier, right around the roads, the milestones. And here we have to set a roadmap. You know, like, what is going to happen in the next 3 months? What is happening afterwards? We'll define that during the next 3 months, right? Just like a roadmap. If we know that we don't know something, be honest about it, right? Be clear on what was defined and what needs to, and be clear on any needs or requests you have for the team to help define the next 3 months. Be clear on the expectations and the objectives, both for the change, both for you, the team, and both for yourself. Again, it's the internal product organization you're working on. Treat it as such. The third example, and this is an interesting one, and I found that even with the most connected teams and teams who are on board with the change, you know, what happens is, as we start going along the change, things start becoming less real, right? We start going to this dark hole where we see things, the complexity is growing, things the change is more complex, the change is more, we start getting switched off from the goals and the objectives we initially defined. We're not sure where this is going. And so we start getting nervous and we start questioning everything. Now, if we look on the one side, the person communicating or who's going, you know, who's controlling the change, maybe, you know, their thoughts might be, we know it's a tough challenge for the teams, that we also know the rewards will be incredible. All changes take time, right? And I've heard this 100 times, which is, all changes take time. We have to go through uncertainty. We have to embrace the discomfort. If they aren't resilient enough, then it's not our fault, right? And the thing is, we have a tendency of blaming the team, blaming the people on the team. On the other side, for the team, right, they see these changes and they started months ago. We've made so many improvements, and they've done a list of things. They've gone through so many things. They've changed so much. But I feel I just have more to take on, and I'm not really seeing any results. I feel it's just becoming a bigger mess. And that's the problem, right? It's the type of thing where if you tell people in the beginning, okay, we're going to get a bit messy and things will get better, it's very easy to interpret that and say, well, I understand it'll be a bit messy. But when you're in the middle of that mess, and that mess stretches out from days, weeks to months, or even years, it does get very harsh for the team, right? And it gets very complicated. So how do we work around that? So one way is to define milestones and celebrate the wins. Hold on. And this is important, right? Make sure that as you go through these points, you celebrate with the team, you connect with the team, you celebrate these moments, and you let them know what's coming through. And qualitative data from other teams or from stakeholders, it's nice to hear, but it's not as tangible for the team. So be careful about that, right? So often just telling them, oh no, we're hearing great things, people are loving the way we're working now, it's great, but they'll take it at face value, right? Show and tell how we're close to the light with concrete examples. And this is an important part, right? Show examples, show how things are working. If you manage to set some measurement or some metrics to measure the impact of the change, show how far along you are on those metrics. It's important, right? Don't ignore their concerns. they're real and they need to be heard. And this is an important part because very often we think it's the team that's not resilient, the team isn't mature enough, the team just isn't ready for change, and they're just being blockers of the change and of things moving forward. But the truth of the matter is it's their reality. And any team, any valid professional with so much uncertainty, it does get confusing. We have to help them through that uncertainty. So I'm going to leave you with some final thoughts, right? And let's just go through a quick summary of everything I discussed in this talk we've discussed, right? So number one, the perception of the individual is their reality. We need to understand that for the individual, their perception of the situation is their reality. We can't pretend it isn't, no matter how hard we try, right? And we can't expect that they interpret it the way we interpret it. That is our own bias working against us as well. Our brains are naturally hotwired to jump to conclusions, and we discuss that. Our brain is lazy. It wants conclusions. It wants easy answers. We have to make a conscious decision to make that change, right? To change that way of working. We need to make a conscious effort to recognize and mitigate those biases, which is building on what I was saying earlier. Right, we have to do that, and we've got those 5 simple rules to help with that. And we can go back to that. Anyone can go back to them and look again. And it's up to us in our role of product operations to help the organization navigate perception bias, as we are well positioned to do so. We're in a great position to do this because we are able to look from the outside looking in. The problem is when we are driving the change or we are owning the change, we might feel like it's our baby and we might have more difficulty then in mitigating these situations, these biases. But we have to recognize them and do our best to reduce them. Finally, if it doesn't make the world better, don't do it, right? And sometimes we have to be clear about that. If it's not making the product team better, if it's not helping to make the organization better, we have to admit sometimes, even halfway through a change, even after investing hours, months around the change, maybe we have to drop it. Maybe we have to go back to square one because we were wrong from the beginning. Keep that in mind, right? And as a final thought, thanks for watching, and a special thanks to Chris Compson for helping me work through the content of this talk and helping me make some sense of my thoughts. Please drop me questions if you have any. Ping me on LinkedIn, ping me on the PLA channels. Anyone has any questions, please do reach out. Thanks, and yeah, any final questions, do send them over.